The asylum stood on a hill, dark, foreboding. No one went near it. Legends spoke of patients gone mad, doctors driven to cruelty, whispers of experiments gone wrong. It was a place to be feared. The wind howled around the building. Rain lashed against broken windows. Inside, the asylum was silent, waiting. Sarah, Mark, and Emily stood at the foot of the hill, young and foolish. They dared each other to enter. "No way," Sarah said, hugging herself. "It's creepy." Mark scoffed. "Scared?" Emily, always the bravest, stepped forward. "Let's do it." What's the worst that could happen? They didn't know. Not yet. The asylum's entrance was a gaping maw. The doors had long since rotted away. The air inside was cold, damp, and smelled of decay. They walked through long, echoing corridors, past padded cells and rusty medical equipment. Each room held the faint memory of suffering. They found the door at the end of a hallway, iron, heavy. A single word was etched into the metal: fear. Mark grinned. "Here we go." He pushed the door open, the heavy wood creaking ominously as it swung inward. The air inside was cold and damp, sending a shiver down his spine. He hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Sarah, who stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes wide with fear. The room was circular, with stone walls and a single flickering light casting eerie shadows. The light seemed to dance on the walls, creating an unsettling atmosphere. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic. As soon as they stepped inside, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Sarah gasped, her heart racing. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The sound echoed through the room, amplifying her fear. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls inching closer with every passing second. It was as if the room itself was alive, breathing and closing in on them. The flickering light cast long, menacing shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at them. The walls were closing in, inch by inch, the space growing smaller and smaller. Sarah could feel the cold stone pressing against her back, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She hated small spaces, the feeling of being trapped. Sarah's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She hated small spaces. The sensation of the walls closing in on her was overwhelming, suffocating. She could feel her chest tightening, her heart pounding in her ears. They made her feel trapped, suffocated. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, pressing in on her, squeezing the air from her lungs. She felt like she was drowning, unable to catch her breath. "We're trapped!" she cried, her voice high-pitched with fear. The sound echoed off the stone walls, amplifying her terror. She could see the panic in Mark and Emily's eyes, their faces pale and drawn. Mark and Emily exchanged worried glances. They could feel the room closing in on them too, the air growing thinner, the walls pressing in. They knew they had to find a way out, and fast. This was more than just a spooky building. This room was alive. It seemed to have a will of its own, a malevolent force that wanted to trap them, to crush them. They could feel its presence, a dark, oppressive energy that filled the space. Section 5, Mark's fear, spiders everywhere. Mark had always been terrified of spiders. Even the smallest ones would send shivers down his spine, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to face. As the walls pressed in, a new horror emerged. The room seemed to be alive, pulsating with a sinister energy. The air grew thick, and Mark could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Spiders, hundreds of them. They moved in unison, a dark, writhing mass that seemed to have a mind of its own. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he watched them advance, pouring from cracks in the walls, from beneath the door. They seemed to come from every direction, an unstoppable tide of legs and fangs. Mark's mind raced, searching for an escape. Big, hairy spiders with glistening fangs. Mark screamed. He hated spiders, always had. The sight of their hairy bodies and sharp fangs filled him with a dread he couldn't shake. Their spindly legs, their cold, unblinking eyes. Each movement they made seemed calculated, as if they were toying with him. Mark's skin crawled as he felt their presence all around him. They filled him with primal terror, a fear so deep it felt like it was etched into his very being. He had never felt so helpless, so vulnerable. He swatted at them, but they kept coming. No matter how many he brushed away, more would take their place. It was as if the room itself was spawning them. crawling on his arms, his legs, his face. He could feel their tiny legs scuttling across his skin, their fangs grazing his flesh. The sensation was unbearable. He fell to the ground, his screams echoing in the shrinking room. The walls seemed to close in even more, trapping him in this nightmarish scenario. Emily kicked at the spiders, trying to reach Mark, but they were everywhere. She could see the terror in his eyes, and it broke her heart. She had to get to him, but the spiders were relentless. The room was a nightmare, a living, breathing nightmare. Every corner, every crevice was filled with spiders. There was no escape, no respite. Mark and Emily were trapped in a web of fear with no way out. Then as quickly as it started, it stopped. The spiders vanished. The walls stopped closing in. Mark lay on the floor, sobbing, covered in imaginary spiders. Emily rushed to his side, her own fear surging. Not spiders, not small spaces. Her fear was different. Being left behind, abandoned. She looked from Mark to Sarah, her heart pounding. What if this room turned on them? What if it used their fear against them, turning them against each other? She had to get them out. But how? They spent what felt like hours in that room. The air grew thick with fear and despair. Every time they thought it couldn't get worse, it did. Whispers slithered from the walls, whispering their deepest fears, their darkest secrets. The room was a pressure cooker pushing them to the edge. Their sanity frayed, their friendships strained. They were trapped in a nightmare. And the nightmare was just beginning. Then a figure appeared in the flickering light, tall, gaunt, its features obscured by the shadows. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding towards them. The figure stopped in front of them. Its eyes, two burning embers, seemed to bore into their souls. A low chuckle echoed through the room, sending chills down their spines. "Welcome," the figure rasped, its voice like dry leaves scraping on stone, "to the room that knows your fears." The figure reached out a hand, its touch promising unimaginable horror. Sarah screamed, her voice piercing the oppressive silence of the room. Mark whimpered, his body trembling uncontrollably as he tried to back away from the looming terror. The air was thick with fear, every breath a struggle, every heartbeat a countdown to an unknown doom. The figure's presence was suffocating, an embodiment of their deepest nightmares come to life. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, savoring the terror it induced in its victims. Sarah's scream echoed, a desperate plea for help that would never come. Mark's whimpers grew softer, his strength waning as the figure drew closer. The room seemed to close in around them, the walls pressing in, trapping them in this living nightmare. Emily closed her eyes, bracing for the worst. She could feel the cold, malevolent energy of the figure as it approached, its presence a dark cloud that threatened to consume her. She tried to steady her breathing, to calm the frantic beating of her heart, but it was no use. The fear was too overwhelming, too all-encompassing. She could hear the soft, almost inaudible footsteps of the figure as it moved closer, each step a harbinger of doom. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she prepared for the inevitable. But the worst never came. Instead, there was a moment of eerie silence, a pause in the relentless onslaught of terror. Emily cautiously opened her eyes, her vision adjusting to the dim light of the room. She looked around in surprise, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The figure was no longer in front of her. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the lingering sense of dread. Instead, she heard a blood-curdling scream. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the dark room. The scream was filled with such raw, primal terror that it sent shivers down Emily's spine. She turned towards the source of the sound, her eyes wide with fear. She opened her eyes to see the figure holding Sarah in the air, her eyes wide with terror. Sarah's body was limp, her face a mask of pure horror. The figure's grip was unyielding, its dark, shadowy form almost blending into the darkness of the room. Emily could see the fear in Sarah's eyes, a reflection of her own terror. Then, with a flick of its wrist, the figure tossed Sarah into the shadows. Her body flew through the air, disappearing into the darkness, as if swallowed by the room itself. There was no sound, no thud of impact, just an eerie silence that followed her disappearance. She vanished without a sound. The room seemed to absorb her, erasing her existence in an instant. Emily's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The figure's power was beyond comprehension, a force of pure malevolence that defied the laws of reality. Mark, his eyes wide with terror, scrambled back only to meet the same fate. He tried to run, his movements frantic and uncoordinated, but it was no use. The figure's reach was inescapable. It grabbed him with a swift, almost casual motion, pulling him into the shadows. His screams echoed through the room, a haunting reminder of the fate that awaited them all. He disappeared into the darkness, his screams echoing through the room. Emily was alone. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. She stood there, frozen in place, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. The figure had taken them all, one by one, and now it was her turn. The figure turned to her, its grin widening. It seemed to take pleasure in her fear, feeding off her terror. Its eyes glowed with a malevolent light, a promise of the horrors yet to come. Emily could feel its gaze piercing through her, a cold, unrelenting force that left her paralyzed with fear. "Your fears are delicious," it hissed, its voice a chilling whisper that sent shivers down her spine. The words hung in the air, a sinister promise that filled her with dread. The figure's face twisted into a grotesque smile, its eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. "And you, my dear, have so many more to give." The figure's words were a cruel taunt, a reminder of the power it held over her. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. But deep down she knew there was no way out. The figure's grip on her was unbreakable, its power absolute. The room was no longer just a room, it was a monster. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the shadows shifting and writhing as if alive. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, a palpable fear that hung over everything. Emily could feel the room closing in around her, its malevolent presence suffocating. And it was hungry. The end? The room seemed to come alive, its hunger a tangible force that threatened to consume her. Emily stood there, her mind a whirlwind of fear and despair, knowing that there was no escape from the nightmare that had become her reality.